The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. The Kannewischer family, from Berlin to Rochester to Arlidge Drive, presented by Cynthia Howk, recorded Tuesday, April 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m.
Tonight's speaker is Cynthia Howk. Cynthia was the Architectural Research Coordinator at the Landmark Society of Western New York for 45 years. Now retired, she continues to research and lecture, including working with local residents to organize their family archives. Please welcome Cynthia Howk.
Completely wiped out. The street does not even exist anymore. But she had photographs, family documents, some that have been rolled up for 100 years, and photographs of everyday life that are next to impossible for historians to expect to come across. I was oohing and eyeing and hyperventilating over all of this material, and Betty said, really, it's important? I said, oh my gosh, yes. I said, I've never seen a lot of this. Little brochures and publicity material from the 1920s from two companies I had never heard of, Wilson Memendex and the Linotype company in Rochester. Any of you ever heard of these companies? All right, well then you are business nerds, because these were pretty small, and Linotype was bought out by Remington in 1928, but Memendex, which is an incredible story, was still going in the 60s. And these were little specialty companies that you go, they did what? They made what? You mean they distributed that all over the world? So she had all of these materials, and I said, Betty, I would be glad to take them, and I will find a professional archive for these to go to. Because I knew once my archive colleagues got a load of what we had, they would be just dumbstruck that we had found any kind of material like this. Do you think you're going to have it? And in fact, there is a nice fairy tale ending to the story. When I took a few pieces from the collection up to the University of Rochester's Reschries Library. That's the big building with the big dome that's on campus. And I talked to Autumn Haig, who is the assistant director for special collections. And I knew when I showed her one specific picture, which you will see tonight, I'd have her right where I wanted her. But she gave some information to me that made it even more compelling that they wanted this collection at Reschries Library. Because the youngest of the Kannewischer, that's how it's pronounced. I was saying Kannewischer, but it's the John Kannewischer. The youngest daughter would become Director of Public Relations for the YWCA from 1938 to 1962, the years of their greatest growth, and their big modern building on North Clinton was constructed. And it turns out the YWCA archives, which is enormous, live up at Reschries Library at the U of R. So this connection through the YWCA and the youngest daughter made it a slam dunk that the U of R will be taking these materials, which right now are all over my living room, because I have been photographing them and spending hours putting this talk together so that I could show you some of the most remarkable archival material to come down the pike in a very long time. Because again, so many people, in Betty's case, she had no nieces or nephews, because her brothers and sisters did not have children. She had no children herself. Some of her Bragan's cousins are here tonight, and 2 weeks ago I got to talk to Betty for the first time in about 10 years, so that was thrilling. So she didn't think, oh, we're not important, we're not famous, who's going to want all this stuff? Put a bunch of historians around a table and put this stuff on the table, and you will have a super over-the-top delighted group of professionals because they do realize how remarkable these materials are that start back in the 1880s and go right up until the 1980s. Oh, hooray! Good work, good work. All right, now I don't see anything on my screen, so how am I going to change?
I'll have to give you the mouse.
All of the Kannewischer family history, the 6 children who are very different, all touch on really important points of American history for all through the 20th century.
Well, I can't see it there. I got it. Yeah. He was going to record this part, so I'm.
Molly, come over here. Oh,
Right.
How many of you are from German, I don't say Germany, German-speaking heritage? I say that because it's very important to know. We'll do a little, I kill some more time, so we'll do a little seminar. How many of you can tell me the year that Germany was first created as a unified country?
1871.
You win. 1871. Before that, if you were in Berlin, that was the capital of the Kingdom of Prussia. That's where Kaiser Wilhelm, or as the Kannewischer boy that was in World War I, Uncle Freddie, he was how he referred to the Kaiser. If you lived in the South, you were in Bavaria, another kingdom. One set of relatives on my mother's side came from Mecklenburg, Pomerania, a very pretty place up on the Baltic Sea, just due west of Prussia. And there were all these little kingdoms and principalities. There were city-states. They all had different names. So I always say German-speaking because, frankly, if your ancestors came here before 1871, they're really not German. They are Mecklenburg Pomeranians, or they're Prussians, or the Bavarians, or some other exotic name that doesn't exist anymore other than in history and geography books.
How are we doing?
Now with the Kannewischer family, Mr. Kannewischer did come from Berlin, and we have 2 remarkable documents that he brought with him that give him a government approval of his profession, which was Kleidmacher für Herren. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Anyone?
Yes.
Okay, Kleidmacher means a clothes maker or a tailor. Für is for Herren, Herrn. It's the plural of man. Herr is like Herr Schmidt, Mr. Smith. So he was a tailor for men. And it turned out there's a lot of missing pieces in the early Kannewischer because Mr. Kannewischer was sponsored to come to Rochester and was living with the family whose daughter he married, Mary Rauch. So I don't know if this was sort of like a mail order bridegroom because no one's alive, and Betty has no idea about this era. But that was how he came to Rochester at a time period in the 1870s, early 80s, when there were tens of thousands of Germans coming here. In fact, there was an article in the Democrat and Chronicle about 15 years ago saying, of all of the different cultural and ethnic groups that have ever come to Rochester, there are more people of German descent today than any other ethnic group. How many people of German descent somewhere on your family tree are in the room? There we are. It's probably half of the people here. And I can throw in Switzerland because that's the most recent. My grandfather and his family came from Switzerland in the late 1880s. So that's another German-speaking country.
I think we're working.
We're working.
Okay, and now what do I do?
Let's click them up.
You mean here?
All right.
How did that work?
Oh my
Nice
God.
fireplace.
Wow, that's so nice.
Wow.
Wow.
So,
Do you want to buy
do you have to be?
I know a refugee
Right, if I
family
just say
that lives on
change.
West Craig
Will
Hill
you be
Drive.
my
What's that?
technical
I know a
person?
refugee family that
All right,
lives.
I'm gonna look at this screen so I don't crane my neck. Can we go back to the first one? And I think we can dim the lights, does that?
You don't need to, I don't think, with
Okay. Next. Whoops, where's Betty?
I think that was wet.
Is that good or you want
Corrupted.
more?
Yeah.
Well, this is a slide where I showed Betty standing by her front door of her magnificent, pristine ranch house at 129 Craig Hill Drive. Change. And this is what she invited me into. It's interesting because the living room is on the back of the house. There's a super huge glass window, picture window. And this is the driveway. This is the fireplace that I talked about that Betty had that never had a fire in it. But sitting to the left of the fireplace are three good friends of Betty's. Next. That is Kitty, Teddy, and Sporty Dog. And I packed up Kitty. I wanted to bring her tonight, and then I forgot to bring her. These are Betty's toys from the 1920s, which I also have as part of the archive. Next. And there I wanted Betty to sit at the fireplace and pose with her wonderful toys. The kitty is homemade. Sporty Dog is a mechanical toy that doesn't mechanical anymore. And Teddy is, I think, also homemade of wool. Next. This is what she started to show me in the living room. Next. Endless photographs, albums, paraphernalia, newspaper clippings. It went on and on. Some things I didn't unroll till just a week ago because I was really nervous that they were too fragile. Next. Photo albums, no captions. Our wonderful relatives, if they got photos of family friends and they knew who their name was, they just put these in the photo album and put no names on it. I'm sure you've run into this. Every single picture in this album, which is fabulously interesting, none of them are identified. So that's a gap in a researcher project. Next. It had documents. Every certificate these 6 children got in school, the documents are in the archive. When they graduated from old school number 18, which is it's now the Gant Center, the corner of North Street and Draper. Next. We had a beautiful hot cocoa set made in Austria. And I had that nice pink towel I thought it would make a nice. That was wrapped up in lots of tissue in a box. Next. This is the neighborhood we're talking about, where the Kannewischers lived. The old Baden, Ormond, Hudson Avenue, and you are looking at a view that was taken just last week. The building on the left is 46 Lowell Street, which is remarkable in its own right because it was the Call, K-A-L-L, the Call family grocery store for over 60 years. Mr. Call was the founder of the Rochester Grocers Association, and the family lived there into the 1960s. The back brick carriage house was the original ceramic studio for the Call grandson. His name is Lynn Phelan. If you Google that name, Phelin, he's one of the founders of the School of American Craftsmen and a nationally renowned potter and artist. But if you look on the right, there's just big open fields with scraggly grass, some companies, a few other buildings, and that was all parallel streets with German names like Rhine Street, Vienna Street. We said Baden Street, it should be Baden Street. Those are all gone, cleared in urban renewal during the 1960s. Next.
I actually helped design that mall.
There are a few remnants in that Hudson Avenue neighborhood. On your right, it was built in the 1880s. It's the second building for what was Memorial Presbyterian Church. My mother's family went there. It is now a Baptist church. On your left is, just around the corner on Helena Street, is a former German Lutheran church. Well, if you're Lutheran, you're German. That's pretty much how it goes. That is now an African-American Protestant congregation. Next. One building has survived right up the street. This is at the corner of Hudson and Upper Falls. This is an 1880s grocery store. Your classic, the family has a grocery or a meat market or a bakery on the first floor, and upstairs is where you live in a very spacious apartment. This would be recognizable to the Kannewischers today, but the rest of their neighborhood that they knew has been wiped off the face of the earth. Next. And here is the Kannewischer house, number 29 Rhine Street, which I just went ballistically happy when I saw this picture. This is a rather large house for that neighborhood. It was on the north side. Rhine Street was 1 block long, and it ran west off of Hudson Avenue, south of what's now Upper Falls Boulevard. Look very closely at this spacious house. I guess that there's probably a smaller house there. You can just see the roof to the left of the house next door. But you're going to see way in the back another pitched gable roof. That is not on the 1888 plat map, but it shows up on the 1900 plat map. Mr. Kannewischer built that addition, and that is where he had his own tailor shop right at home. He apparently worked at some point for Stein Block Clothing Company, which was one of the largest clothing manufacturers in town. How many of you knew about Rochester being a clothing center? What's the only one left today? Excellent, Hickey Freeman. But that's only one. There were dozens. There were huge factories that sometimes had over 1,000 employees. Michael Stern was downtown. Stein Block. Hart was on Hart Street, just around the corner from Bausch and Lomb. But you had a lot of people that were independently, that worked themselves. And Mr. Kannewischer apparently was one very talented and successful entrepreneur as a tailor. Next. Let's introduce you to Mr. and Mrs. John or Johann Kannewischer, Kannewischer, although some of his children would drop the C later on. It's interesting to look at their headstones that are all together. Some of them are spelled with SC, others are just spelled with S. This was taken at the John Taylor photography studio in downtown Rochester. Taylor was one of the best photographers in the city. On the left, you have John Kannewischer. On the right, you have his wife, Mary Rauch Kannewischer. This is probably in the 1890s when she's already had her 9 children. Yes, ladies, in the 19th century, on average, you were pregnant every 18 months. Doesn't that sound like fun? Mrs. Kannewischer's first child was William in 1883. Then there were 2 stillbirths. They are recorded, and they are in Mount Hope Cemetery in the Kannewischer plot. Then they had Bill, and then a little girl named Emma, who sadly died of whooping cough before her 2nd month. She is up at Mount Hope with her parents. Then we had a string of success. We had Fred, Cora, Charlotte, Cora, and Bertha. And that makes there are 6 living children who would make it far into adulthood. Next. Here are those documents I mentioned. The one in the back is the official German document that says, yes, Johann Kannewischer is a professional tailor for men's clothing. And in the front, the kind of thing that gets thrown away is his business card from when he was in business in Berlin, Germany, and identifies him as a Kleidermacher für Herren, and it gives his address, which is Stahlschreiberstraße 12. So he's at 12 Stahlschreiber Street. And Reparter werden, he will also do repairs, is what that says at the bottom. This is the kind of document that does not survive a few years, much less 100 years. So, but in this archive, it has survived. Next. Mr. Kannewischer, as far as I know, did not bring any siblings with him to Rochester when he came in the 1880s, but he kept in touch with his brother August Kannewischer and family. Here they are in a 1910 photograph that they sent over because one of the daughters was engaged to be married. If you look, ladies, if you look at these clothes, these are not something you and I would attempt with a Simplicity Pattern 26. These are highly elegant, very beautifully crafted clothing. Next. And they kept in touch over the years with their family. Here's a Christmas photo from the 1920s, cousins in Germany, I'm not sure where. But if you look in the back, I was thrilled to see the typical German Christmas tree, which still has lighted candles. And there's a note on this that says, "Note the new slippers that the boys are wearing. They're striped." And this is really fun to see because my own family, we have kept in touch with our Swiss cousins for the past 90 years. So it's nice to see this is another family that has done that. Next. Here we are, here they are. Here is the Kannewischer family in 1907. In the back on the left is, Carl. In the next row on the far left is Mr. Kannewischer and his wife Mary. This is one of the few photos we have of her. And at the far right end of the second row is Fred. And in front we have Cora, baby sister Bertha, and Charlotte. Next. Here is a picture of the Christmas tree at the Kannewischer house on Rhine Street. Now, I've guessed it was probably circa 1900. It is very rare to see interior photographs at this period at somebody's house. Your little brownie camera or whatever, you had to have a lot of light. So any of the interior photographs you're seeing tonight are as rare can be because, again, this was not George Eastman, who had all kinds of photographers available to him. This is just your everyday working class family who managed to take photos inside the house. Next. Now, they must have loved dogs because there's a lot of pictures of dogs over the years. You have Fred and a boxer on the left, and you have Cora with a, I will call it, mixed breed dog on the right. Next. And Charlotte must have been very interested in animal welfare. This is an early 20th century certificate from the Rochester Humane Society that says Cora is a member of it. They're in their junior division because she's interested in the welfare of animals. Next. They went to school number 18, which, as I mentioned, was on the northeast corner of Draper and North Street, which was about a 15-minute walk east of where they lived on Rhine Street. There is no school there today. The school they went to was torn down in the 20s, and its successor was interestingly made into GI housing in the late 1940s after World War II, which I had never read about. Next. Here is one of those rare photos. As I mentioned, they had a tailoring operation at the back of the house. Here is Fred in the tailor shop cutting fabric to get ready to tailor. This is one of the most important photos I've ever seen because it's showing children working in a family business at home indoors. A document like this is just beyond description as to its rarity. Next. Now, the Kannewischers, it was not all let's be Germans and always do things proper, and they had fun. And here we see them down on Arundequoit Bay in the early 1900s. There is a boat on the left, and the first three people at the bow, and then the next two are Kannewischers. And apparently they had some sort of access to, these cottages are long gone, but this is a cottage that was up on what's called German Village, up on the northwest side of the bay. It's still there. It's sort of north of Titus Avenue in Seneca. You can sort of go down the windy hills and still get there. But these were rented, and most people got there by boat. You take a boat from Shalott and the river, you go out into the lake, and then you go over to the Arundequoit Bay, and then you'd sail into the bay, and they'd drop you off at these different cottages that were for rent. Next. The Kannewischers came to Arundequoit Bay. In the winter, we have a skating photograph of the four of them out on the bay, but they came there for other reasons. Here we have Cora with her two Japanese parasols, so that told me it was early 20th century when there was a real craze for all things Japanese. And then a rare picture of Bill on somebody's boat called the Cordelia. Now, there was a Cordelia later on in the family, but I don't think this had anything to do with that. Next. Our most adventuresome sibling of the six seems to be baby Bertha. This is Bertha rowing the boat on Arundequoit Bay on the left. And then a few years later, ladies, get a load of those bathing suits or swimming, what do they call them? Swimsuits or bathing attire. She's got a paddle and she's about to go swimming, but I think if that got wet, it would be very difficult to swim in it. Next. This is Bertha, even younger, somewhere on horseback in the early 1900s. So they had access somehow to somebody who was out in the country since they lived very much in the city. Next. And these photos just blew me away. These are interior photos in the living room and dining room on Rhine Street. And they are, there's no marks on these photographs, so I had to do some sleuthing. But I had my suspicions. This is one of the earliest meetings of the Campfire Girls in Rochester, New York. How many of you heard of the Campfire Girls? They actually started before the Girl Scouts. They were founded in 1910 by a gentleman who thought it would be good for girls to get out of doors, fresh air, a lot of woodcraft, and you learned a lot about Native Americans. That's why they're dressed. That was my clue, is they're dressed with the headbands and sort of like in a Native American costume. And they're having a meeting at home. Bertha is on the bigger photograph on the far right, the second girl in her front of her dress is all lit up. And she's the second from the right in the smaller photo. Now, I want to warn you about researching with the Democrat and Chronicle or any newspaper. When I started researching this, and the Democrat and Chronicle, because I'm still a Girl Scout. I've been a member since I was in 3rd grade. And I knew the Girl Scouts started in 1912. There's a big article in a 1950s Democrat and Chronicle article interviewing this woman who announced that she brought Campfire Girls to Rochester for the first time in the 1950s. And I thought, no, there's something, what goes on and on. She went to a meeting in Syracuse, thought it was wonderful, and she set it up, and there were lots of Campfire Girls, which is now a co-ed organization. But I found the 1917 articles in the Democrat and Chronicle that said the Campfire Girls were getting together for a 5th anniversary of the Rochester group, and there were 200 of them. So then I knew this is a campfire. These are Campfire Girl photos. I have no idea how they got involved. The Campfire Girl meetings that I read about in the newspaper, one was held at Mechanics Institute, old RIT, over on Spring Street in the 3rd Ward. The other meeting was held at Temple-Brith Codish, which at that time was on Gibbs Street and Grove Street downtown. So that could have been how Bertha knew about Campfire Girls, because her family's Lutheran church, which is still there, was right next door to Temple-Brith Codish. It's now apartments, but they were members of the oldest Lutheran church in the city, and that church was immediately next door to Brith Codish. Next, please. Now, when I showed these 2 pictures to several people who I know are super nerds when it comes to old cars, they hyperventilated all over the place, because I knew this was not your grandfather's Model T or my grandfather's Model A. Mr. Kannewischer, according to my friend who knows automobiles, he said, those are really expensive cars. The other thing that's amusing in these cars, you see Mr. Kannewischer sitting at the steering wheel. He never drove a car in his life. Obviously, it was the boys who learned how to drive. The car on the left is a 1904 Ford Model AC, which is about the same as a Model A, but it has a larger motor and radiator. So it's a really, and you get in from the back. You don't get in from the side, you get in from the back. The car on the right is a 1913 Overland Model 64-5, which again is a touring car, and that picture was taken up at White City. That's up in Arundecoit on Lake Ontario off of St. Paul Boulevard. So Mr. Kannewischer, as my friends told me, they didn't say what they cost, but these are 2 really expensive and very early cars. The one on the left being from 1904. How many cars do you think we had in Monroe County in that era? There's a statistic. For all of Monroe County, how many cars in 1904?
1,000.
What? What did you say, Bill?
1,000?
Yes, we had 1,000 automobiles in Monroe County, and the Kannewischers owned one of them. and then by 1913 traded it in for a touring car. Next. Here are some of the photographs of when the family went. The kids are have grown up. It's probably about 1920. And these are rare photos of White City, which was an enterprise run by the railroad that was right next door. You could rent these platform tents in the summertime. These were for regular folks. If you couldn't afford to go to the Thousand Islands or some other destination, you could come from Rhine Street, you could get on the streetcar, and you could easily get out to White City. So you see Charlotte on the left and Charlotte on the right. And when you look at a lot of the pictures of this family, everybody has a nickname except Carl. Frederick is Fred. William is William. Charlotte is Lot. Bertha is Bert. And Cora, she says Cora is Cora. But that's really important because some letters later are addressed to Bert, and you think that they must be writing to a man, but they're not. They're writing to Bertha. Next, please. Sadly, in 1912, Mrs. Kannewischer died. She was only in her 60s. This is a really elegant studio photo, and my guess is her husband made that highly sophisticated jacket with that flared peplum, lots of seams, beautiful cuff work, just gorgeous, gorgeous tailoring. When she died, it appears that Charlotte, the oldest daughter, became the lady of the house and would remain in that role for many years to come. She never married. Next. About 1914, the first of the children got married. Fred, who would have several careers as a forester, a janitor, he was in the Civilian Conservation Corps during the 1930s. Here is a rare photo of Fred and his lovely wife, Clara Schmidt. And sadly, she died not long afterwards. She died in 1916 of tuberculosis, and she is buried not with Fred, but with her parents up in Mount Hope Cemetery. Next. Bertha graduated from high school in 1916, and that meant East High School. Here she is in her school yearbook photograph. She was involved with the German club, no surprise, and not basketball, but you played basketball. 2 words. Here is her diploma from East High School, which opened in 1901 as the first modern high school in the city. Next. And here is the name of the East High, the cover of the 1916 yearbook called The Sphinx, and there on the right, imposed in front of the beautiful East High School at 410 Alexander Street, today it's apartments. Here is the entire class of 1916. Next. Now, education was really important to the family. I have every graduation certificate ever issued to any of these children. This happens to be an official public school of Rochester graduation certificate that is telling us that Bill Kannewischer is not only graduating from school number 18, he has now been officially declared eligible to enroll in the earlier city high school known as the Rochester Free Academy. You all know this building down on Fitzhugh Street. For years it was the head of the Board of Education. Next. Bertha is the once sibling who went to college. She enrolled at the University of Rochester. There she is on the left, standing in front of one of the stone buildings on the Prince Street campus. There was no river campus at this point. And when Bertha graduated from college, there is her college diploma on the right. It's one of the things that we had to unroll and look at. Next. During the same time period, her brother Fred sought employment. Fred was, I don't know if he had ADHD, but all of his jobs seemed to be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. He bounced around a lot, but he was extremely talented in the marketing field. And he had worked in Rochester, then he went out to Ohio, then he came back to Rochester. When he wanted to enroll in the Army for World War I, he got letters of recommendation from his former supervisors saying that he was a patriot, that there was no finer person, because remember that last name, Kannewischer, could have made the military service slightly askance as to would they be patriots or not, because they were of German heritage. Fred worked at something called Line a Time Company, which was in the old Orthodox Jewish synagogue on St. Paul Street. It's gone now. Line of Time made typewriter accessories. Here you see on the left a promotional brochure saying if you have a Line of Time frame that you can put up against your typewriter, you can easily see one line at a time while you, the stenographer or typist, are typing. And I've got one of these frames at home. Betty had it at her house. Line of Time produced a beautiful 1920s Christmas booklet with everyone's name and photograph in it. Next, please. Fred, top left, was head of marketing. And these were some of the Line of Time personnel booklets that were produced. One was called The Ledger. It had to do with all kinds of national developments in the field of typing and stenography. And then if we can go to the next slide. Oops, no, go back. I'm sorry. I want you to take a look at the brown book and its very interesting title. And I started reading this and thought, oh, the title really doesn't indicate what it's actually going to say. There it is. The Women Who Work is the title at the top. An essay on pacifity and progress by William Hill Brereton. Now, at first, when you see this, you think you're going to say, well, these ladies shouldn't be working, you should be at home. This is one of the most interesting feminist tracts I've ever read in my life that basically said, if you're going to work, you should be proud of this. And it's a real endorsement of women's capabilities. I can't wait to see some of the U of R staff looking at this brochure because they also collect a lot of women's history up there. And some of these very interesting personnel brochures that were published in the 20s are very unexpectedly pro-get women into the workforce. Next. Bill, who basically did bookkeeping and he worked at a bank, he's sort of not as well-known a figure, but these are some of his beautiful pencil drawings that are in the family archives. On the left is a view of a village in, I believe it's West Virginia, and the really lovely drawing on the right is rooftops in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He was a really, really good artist, and I don't know where he got his training. Next. Now, in the teens, we have World War I, which the United States did not enter until it started in 1914, but we didn't enter until 17 and 18. Ironically, I found for Carl, who was the only one of the two boys that went into combat, Carl originally applied for a deferment and it was denied. This was all in the newspaper. Fred entered the Navy in 1917, and I wondered if he was still in mourning for his wife who had died the year before, because Fred would stay in the Navy through about 1921. Fred is in the group on the left, and Carl is in his snappy soldier's uniform in the photograph on the right. Next. This caption does not even begin to describe the entire file of some of the most incredibly detailed, heart-wrenching, and forthright correspondence that represents Carl's letters from England and France back to his family. Some of them are typed because he had access to a typewriter. They're single space, they go on for 2 pages. They are just mind-blowing to read. Many of them are handwritten, and fortunately his handwriting is very good. This happens to be a postcard showing Folkestone on the east shore of England. He's ready to go from England over to France with his unit. And it has some writing at the top about how beautiful England is. It's so green, it's so lovely. And it was really interesting after having read all these letters. When I met Betty 2 weeks ago, she said, oh yes, when Uncle Carl lived with us, he didn't talk very much. Well, he might not have talked very much, but he was an absolutely spectacular writer. And that may have had something of the reason why he was successful in the marketing field. But his World War I correspondence is just dazzling. And one of the surprises when I looked in the folder was he sent several letters to a Miss Elsie Clark on Rutgers Street, no address. I looked her up. She is the mother of a very good friend of mine who's a professional organist. and she's already in her 80s. When I told her I have letters to her mom from World War I couldn't have surprised Margaret Ann Milne more. She goes, "How did you get letters to my mother?" I said, "They're all in this file. I will give you copies." Next, please. Here are some of the letters. See how closely spaced? The one on the left is handwritten. The one on the right is typewritten, but they are so detailed. He talks about being in combat, which I think infects him through the rest of his life. He gets very involved with current events and other causes. He talks about being in German bunkers of poured concrete, because the Germans, they built bunkers to last. They weren't going to be digging out muddy trenches. And that's where he lost his glasses, and he had to have them replaced at a local hospital. So just reading these documents, I would think any military museum would be very interested in having copies of them. Next. Now, one of the letters in this grouping of letters from World War I gave a surprise 2 weeks ago to Betty Fetter, because she had never heard anything of this. The letter is written from Carl to Fred. Fred has obviously written a letter from the Navy. He's in the Navy, but he's in the States. He would never go into combat or leave the country. But what Carl says in the letter says, "Well, I think it's great that Dad's thinking of matrimony." And I saw this word at first handwritten, and I'm going, M-A-T-R. Oh my God, he wants to get married again. He's widowed. His wife died in 1912. And he wants to remarry somebody named Aunt Till, who you see in this picture, a nice, well-fed German-type lady. We don't know quite who Aunt Till is. When I talked to Betty 2 weeks ago, she thinks Aunt Till was like a family friend. They didn't get married, but that clearly there was something in the works when this letter was written. So we have a mystery. Who was Aunt Till? Somebody from church, somebody from the neighborhood? We don't know yet, but they did not marry. Next. Bertha does marry. Bertha becomes the first girl to get married. Or I'm sorry. Oh, I've typed this wrong. Bertha graduates from the U of R in 1920, but just about the same time, her sister Cora marries and becomes a Braggins. And ladies, back in the 1920s, there were classes for women at Mechanics Institute. If you were going to get married, they had classes to teach you how to be a good wife. What you see on the left is the handwritten recipe book that Cora put together in that Mechanics Institute class on learning to cook for the new wife. So we've got this documentation, and some of the recipes are really fabulous. So again, this is the sort of thing that gets lost, but here it is in the archive. Next. In 1922, Mary Elizabeth Braggins was born, the only Kannewischer grandchild, as far as we know. And I was going to bring tonight, these are two splendid photographs of toddler Betty Fetter with her wonderful little toys. And if you remember when we looked at the fireplace, there was a toy named Kitty. On the left, you can see the toddler Betty with Kitty, one of her favorite toys. On the left, she has a little dog that's a push cart. She said it had little wheels that went around as she pushed it. And this is at the house that she and her parents lived at for many years, Leander Road, which is near Boxart Street, off of Lake Avenue. Next. Things changed a lot by the end of the teens. While Mr. Kannewischer, for whatever reason, decided not to marry, he decided to close his tailor shop. That was also in that letter. He said, "We're glad that Dad's going to close the shop." The neighborhood had been changing. There were a lot of synagogues and a lot of newcomers, particularly Orthodox Jewish families from Eastern Europe. So they sold the house on Rhine Street and they moved over to Laburnum Crescent, which is on the Upper Monroe neighborhood, not far from Cobbs Hill Park. And this is 222 Laburnum Crescent, which they would live in through the 1920s and into the 30s. It's the blue house on the right. Next. Carl, always busy doing something. One of the most incredible documents we have in this archive is his complete application and certificate giving him a U.S. patent for a machine to test the durability of typewriter ribbons. Here is the official document from the U.S. Patent Office, which says that that he has been granted this patent. Next. Here are some of the drawings that he had to submit to the U.S. Patent Office for that. I have no idea if he actually ever manufactured it. Next. So while Carl was doing inventions on the side when he was at Line of Time, here we have two of his daring do sisters. On the left, we have Cora, who's married. Oh, this is before she gets married, but she's on the roof of the old Sibley, Lindsay and Kerr Company department store, and not the most normal position you'd have if you were wearing heels and a skirt. On the right, from about 1930, is her sister, Bertha. After Bertha graduated from college in 1920, she taught for a little while, but then she got a really interesting job at a now defunct newspaper that was run by William Randolph Hearst. She got some real interesting interviews. People like Dorothy Gish. Now we're going to test how good you are. How many have ever heard of Gertrude Ederle, the swimming star? Yep. George Arliss, the movie and theater star. Amelia Earhart was another interview. And she also interviewed Charles Lindbergh, amongst many other people that appeared with her byline in the Rochester Journal-American. But the next photo is the one that I showed to the archivist. There are two 8x10 photos in this archive that if there was nothing else in the archive, they are worth their weight in gold. Okay, ladies, high heels, stockings with seams up the back, a lovely winter coat with fur, a little cloche hat, and by the way, you'll be 6 stories up in the air sitting on steel girders interviewing 2 workers who are building the new Reynolds Arcade at the Four Corners. Here is Bertha in one of the most spectacular photos I've ever seen. In the background, you're looking east, that's Main Street, and you can't see the river because there are buildings on both sides of the Main Street Bridge. How many of you remember that when you couldn't see the river? On the right, you can see one of her chief rivals, the headquarters of the Democrat and Chronicle, which was out on the river until the 1960s, and it was demolished. If you go to the next photo, oops.
Some of them look like they might.
Oh, it's turned the other way and you can't see her high-heeled shoes, but these photos are glorious. They are just so thrilling, and that's why I wanted Bill to put one in the newsletter, because talk about at the office. Here is what most people would never suspect. A young woman newspaper reporter in about 1930 was going to be doing as an assignment during the day. Next. Oops. Now, the Journal-American closed in 1938, so Bertha had to find a new job. Next. But before we get to that, the family continued to be outdoors oriented. Here's a camping trip up at Lindsay Island, in the Thousand Islands, not far from Alexandria Bay. On the left, we have Bill and Lot, or Charlotte, and she's got a dress on because there wasn't a lot of camping gear for women in this time period. And obviously they brought their tent with them. You can see that on the right. Next. In 1931, Bertha gets married. She marries Bill Arlidge. He also attended the U of R class of 1920, but he only went for 2 years, even though all his articles in the Democrat and Chronicle call him a graduate of U of R. He did not graduate. He was only there 2 years. I don't know how they met, if they met when they were students or somehow they met later on. Bill was in insurance for 40 years, and this is the very interesting house they lived in at number 3 Arlidge Drive, which you really can't see from Stone Road. This is a farmhouse that's tucked behind the home that Bill's parents lived in at 891 Stone Road. 2 addresses that when I talked to Betty, she knew that right off the bat. This is a farmhouse that has that stone chimney and that porch that was probably added possibly at the time that Bill and Bertha got married, because they were going to live in the house. Because just in front of them, facing Stone Road, next, is this gloriously beautiful, intact bungalow, which I went online, and the interior of this house has never changed. It's one of the greatest surviving bungalows I've ever seen. Bill Arlidge was born and raised in Greece. His parents, Bill Arlidge Sr., was one of 14 children of an immigrant from England who was in the shoemaking industry in Rochester. Bill's parents came out to the rural Greece, New York, Barnard area in the early 1900s, and there are tons of articles about Bill Arlidge Sr. He would go to meetings at the Barnard School, not the one that's there today. He was involved with the committee that wanted to get the Dewey Avenue trolley line extended to Barnard so people would have easy access to the city because the Lake Avenue trolley line was always crowded. Bill Arlidge Sr. was also involved with building the new school that's there today, the Barnard Elementary School, and he was involved with a lot of other projects in the community. The Arlidges had 2 children, their son Bill, who married Bertha. They had no children, and their daughter Florence, who never married, but we're going to talk a little bit about her a little bit later. Next. The 1930s comes, and we have the Depression. And we know that things could get really difficult. I really don't know the trajectory as well as I could about, on the left, Fred, who had been a janitor, a forester. He had had a number of different jobs. But he became, here you have him, and he's got the back of the card. He said, I just got my head shaved. He is at a Civilian Conservation Corps camp. And on the back of that photo, which is a postcard, he talks about, it says, Bertha, Coral, wouldn't you like to have Sporty Boy here, the dog? And that name, Sporty Boy, was also used for one of Betty's toys. On the right, we have some of the most remarkable advertising memorabilia I've ever seen for any company, but this is not Lina time. This is the Wilson Memendex Company. If you take the word memo and you paste it to the word index, you have Memendex. It is a company that produced file systems and memos and calendars that were distributed all over the world. It started in 1906 by Mr. Wilson. He dies in the 1930s. Next slide, please. Here are some of their products. And again, this is all advertising brochures and memorabilia from the 1930s and 40s. Absolutely thrilling to look at. It's also fun to look at the price tags. Next. This amazing business empire was run by, once Mr. Wilson died, a woman he had hired when he started the company. She had been trained in business at New York University. She was German-born, and her name is Frieda Schreiber. And by the 1930s, she became president and CEO of the Wilson Memendex Company. Here you see Frieda at her desk with lots of flowers on the left side in the 1930s. And she became a very good friend of the Kannewischer family. The photograph on the right shows Frieda on the left standing with 2 of the girls. And the photo at the bottom is very interesting. It's a company picnic for the Memendex employees. But sitting on the picnic table bench on the right-hand side, you can see a white-haired gentleman. This is one of the last photographs of John Kannewischer before he died in 1934. He is sitting immediately next to Frieda Schreiber, and my guess is the 2 of them are talking to each other in German, since they were both German-born. Frieda Schreiber, when she died in the 1960s, she has a stupendous quarter-page article in the Democrat and Chronicle about her life and her acumen as a businesswoman. Every year she took a vacation, she traveled by ship to another country where she was selling Memendex products. So she was constantly going around, supposedly on vacation, but traveling the world, selling these products that were being produced in a very small building on Carter Street that was basically a house that had a concrete block addition on it. So the Memendex Company is quite remarkable, and this is another one of those hidden business stories of Rochester. And again, a woman who was a very successful businesswoman in an industry that she worked in her entire life. Yes, next, please. Now, recreation at 3 Arlidge Drive, we've seen the young sisters Well, now we see on the left, how many of you remember your grandmothers in house dresses? Well, this is sort of the house dress salon of the 1930s. Here we have Cora, Bert, and Lot playing croquet in the backyard of 3 Arlidge Drive, while on the other side is a really lovely picture of the backyard, and I really like the fence that they have there. The man in the white hair is John Kannewischer, the father, and this is probably the last known photo of him. And he's sitting outside with Bill Arlidge in the center and his daughter Charlotte, who's on the right. Next. In the 1930s, during the Depression, while Carl was at Memendex for a while, he went out on his own and became quite an entrepreneur. I have got piles of stationery companies I've never heard of. He started an enlarger company, the KALER photographic. Here we have an enlarger that you can use with a miniature camera. This was one of his short-lived companies. Then, on his own, he decided globes were a real important tool for educating children, so he started a globe-making company, and he had its headquarters down at High Falls. Neither of these lasted very long, but we've got the promotional materials that he created for them. Next. Carl was a real joiner. He liked to join things, and he was, for many years, a member of the Rochester Ad Club, and coordinated a weekly discussion group that would get together for lunch, and they called themselves the Milk and Crackers Group. Now, they weren't eating milk and crackers, according to the Democrat and Chronicle. They took that as sort of a poke in the rib. The Genesee Valley Club, which is the most exclusive social club in town, they had a late afternoon group called the Cheese and Crackers Club. Basically, you got together for cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. So the folks at the Rochester Ad Club thought they'd call themselves the Milk and Crackers Group. And here, again, these are rare surviving artifacts. Here are little promotional buttons from the Rochester Ad Club in the 1930s. And the book on the right is their directory for one of the 1930s. It has all their members, their names, what they're going to do. And this was sent to Carl in an envelope by apparently another member, and I have all of these little tiny pieces of ephemera as part of the collection. Next. Now, Bertha lost her job in 1938. The Rochester Journal-American folded. Hearst came to town. He thought he could put Gannett out of business, but Gannett had other ideas. So Bertha had to get another job. And ironically, it was to an organization that it turned out the family had connections with many, many years before the 1930s. Bertha was hired in 1938 as the Director of Public Relations for the YWCA. Here is their spectacular, modern-style 1951 headquarters that's still there on North Clinton Avenue. This replaced a much smaller building to the rear, which had a Franklin Street address. When this was built in the 1950s, talking about how things had changed, before this building, which upstairs had apartments for nice young ladies that were going to work and you could pay a small amount, it was very glamorous. Before this building existed, the previous YWCA residences for young working women were in 2 locations. One was for working women who happened to be white and Protestant. The other was for colored Protestant working women and was in Cornhill on Clarissa Street. This is a very interesting part of organizational history. The YWCAs all started after the Civil War, just like the YMCAs, and they were basically for Protestant members. That's why we have a Catholic, a CYO downtown, a Catholic youth, and we had a Jewish Y. And when I talk to young people, they go, what do you mean you had a Jewish Y, a Protestant Y, and a Catholic Y? What is this, all this? They don't understand the trajectory of how these organizations have developed over the last 160 years. So one of Bertha's great assignments was to raise the money for this brand new 1951 building that you're looking at. Now, on the left, I put an ad for something called Camp Iola that had nothing to do with tuberculosis. This was the YMCA camp on the west side of Canandaigua Lake before they had Camp Corey on Keuka Lake. I have a feeling the reason Bertha went to work at the YWCA is her husband, Bill, had been going as a kid and teenager to Camp Quarry for years, so he knew all about the YMCA. Bill's sister, Florence, who never married, she had been a summer camp counselor for 6 years at the YWCA Camp Ononda. Some of you may have visited it. It's now a state park. That's on the west side of Canandaigua Lake. So I think Bertha had an in at the YWCA through her sister-in-law, and her sister-in-law's really good friend who was on staff there. Next, please. Here we have, in 1962, we have now a senior citizen, Bertha Kannewischer Arlidge. She's interviewed talking about her career as a newspaper woman, and you're seeing her dressed up for her retirement party in 1962 when she retired from the Y. After many years there, working at the Ad Club, she worked with Presbyterian Church, and she was active with her U of R Alumni Association. Next. The 40s brings some sad news, and because the siblings start to become elderly and ill and die, and the first of the 6 siblings to die was Bill Kannewischer, who had lived on Arlidge Drive with his married sister Cora and her husband for many years. At the same time, during the 1940s, Carl had yet again another job. He went to work for Hawkeye, which is where he retired from, and you're seeing Carl with his retirement party cake on the right-hand side. Next. Sadly, in the 1950s, other passings occur. Fred, who had gone to live at the Oddfellows retirement home in Lockport, Fred died in 1959, as did his sister Charlotte. Now, if you look very carefully at this headstone, you're going to see a different spelling. Wisher. The C has been dropped. Several of the children kept the original Scher spelling, and some of them didn't. They dropped the C and it just was Sher. So when you see them all buried together, it is a little confusing. Next. Carl, in retirement, didn't sit down and let the moss grow under his feet. Here you have Carl visiting Germany in the 1960s. Here's his rail on the right. All of his travel documents are in the archive. That's his Eurail pass from the 1960s and his Eastman Kodak Camera Club card that has a beautiful view of the Hawkeye plant, and his Hawkeye works, and a lot of other paraphernalia that has to do with his travels. And he was also kind of an interesting person in that he put ads in the Democrat and Chronicle ads section. There was a whole column in the advertising section where people who wanted to take a trip and wanted to have someone come along with them would advertise, "Hi, I'm driving out west. Would you like to share a ride and gasoline? And I'm going to be gone for X number of weeks. If you're interested, contact Carl Kannewischer." Now, I don't have any additional, if these ever panned out, today we'd go, "Are you kidding?" And but this is the 1950s. So gasoline's cheap, Carl has a car, but he wanted to drive with somebody, probably knowing Carl, he wanted to share expenses. That was the driving force among the way that he was doing this. Next. Carl also became very active, although he'd been very active in their Lutheran church. He changed gears and he joined the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, known for its real being devoted to activism and social causes, because there's a lot of letters in this archive about Carl, talking about what he thinks about the world and current events. He wrote letters to the Democrat Chronicles, letters to the editor. One was when Khrushchev was coming to the United States for the first time. He thought it would be a good idea if just regular Americans would all get together and all send lots of letters to Mr. Khrushchev so he could get a real sense of what real Americans were like, not just the politicians he was going to meet. Another time he wrote a letter to the editor. There was a major steel strike in Pittsburgh, and he had a whole scheme set up as to how you could settle the steel strike. This was Carl at his best. Carl had one more invention in mind. It was an invention that got national publicity and elicited almost 200 letters. On the top left is Modern Maturity from the summer of 1967. Today you know this is the AARP magazine. Carl had sent in a letter to the editor. What you see stacked up on top of that magazine are over 130 letters from all over the United States asking Carl if he would send the drawings to this bandage winder that he had invented. Next. Here is his letter, and I know you can barely see, there's a drawing at the bottom. This is what appeared in Modern Maturity. He said he had taken his sister to her White Cross group meeting at the Baptist church. I'd never heard of White Cross, but now I know about them. And he noticed how all these ladies were struggling to wrap bandages, winding and winding them. Some of them, they could do it on a pencil. So he went home and invented a bandage winder so that the ladies would have a much easier time of winding these bandages. You should read the letters that came pouring in to AARP asking for this man's address. Can you please give me this Carl Kannewischer? Because there was no address. Next. Here are the drawings and instructions that Carl put together so that he said, anybody could, if you had a handy person in your group, anybody could make one of these bandage winders, because I didn't put the instructions list. This is just the drawing. There were so many responses to this. They kept coming in even after Carl's sudden death of a heart attack in 1967. So some of the letters that came in asking for the instructions are addressed to Carl. Some of them, though, they get passed on to his sister Cora Braggins, with whom Carl lived. And just reading these letters from all over the country, from these organizations that were so thrilled to get this to help their volunteers make bandages that were going to be wrapped and sent off to their missionaries abroad. So here's I don't know if, and Carl volunteered, if you really didn't have anybody available in your community to make one, he would do and make one for you free of charge and send it to you. So one last gift to community. Next. So the sad part of the Kannewischer story is that this richly interesting family who did I cut down many of the things that are in the archive that I didn't put in here. They sadly, the ones that were still living in the 1960s, read 2 properties optioned for slum clearance. And one of the properties was their house at 29 Rhine Street, which had been bought and was still being used as a tailor company. They had put on yet another addition to the back of the house. But in the 1960s, it was due for demolition, as was the rest of the neighborhood. And this is the article that announces that. Next. Now, as all of the Kannewischers got along in years, it was Betty Fetter, standing at left, who really helped and kept things going. This is an event at her house where her mother and father are sitting there, as well as her aunt Bertha and her husband. And you can see what time of, what decade it is by the sparkly white Christmas tree that is not like the German tree. You know, very 1950s, they have a sparkly artificial white tree. Next. Cora would die in 1974. That left, the only person left was Bertha, who lived until 1980. And Betty was a fabulous niece. She took her Aunt Bertha to the Rose Garden. She put together this beautiful notebook that you can see on the left that had many pictures and things of Betty's whole life and career, including her perched up on the steel scaffolding in 1931. Next. Bertha died in 1986. The families are interred in 2 different plots. This is their plot in section, oh dear, it was just up there, range 3 at Mount Hope Cemetery. The stones in the back, 6 stones in the back are the Rausch family, Mrs. Kannewischer's parents and siblings. And the stones in the front row to the left are Mr. and Mrs. Kannewischer, her parents, and the little stone at the north end is Emma, the little girl who died less than 2 months old. And you can see the inscription, Kannewischer, spelled with a C on the right, the single headstone for John and his wife Mary. Next. Over at Riverside Cemetery, there are 2 adjacent plots that have Bertha and her husband, Mr. Arlidge, and Cora, Fred, and William, as well as Charlotte. And Bill Arlidge's parents, Mr. and Mrs. William Arlidge Sr., their daughter Florence, who never married but worked as a hygienist, and then a woman named Ruth Whalen, who when she died in 2000 had no surviving relatives listed in her obituary. It said simply, survived by her late friend, Florence Arlidge. And they had both met way back in the 1920s when they were both counselors at the YWCA camp. So here you have the classic modest headstone, which was supposed to be what every headstone in Riverside Cemetery was to look like, because the original design intent for Riverside was to be a park with no monuments above ground. That has changed drastically. But here at the Kannewischer Arlidge plot, they each have an identical headstone, which is absolutely flat to the ground as the original design intent. And if you look really carefully, at the bottom of this headstone, it says M. Elizabeth Fetter, 1922. This is where Betty will be interred, but we hope not for quite some time yet. Next. So, all of these wonderful materials and stories have survived because of one very special person, and that is Betty Fetter, seen here at her 40th anniversary with Eastman Kodak Company. Betty, I was so pleased that we could do this for her archives instead of having going out into the trash, which was another option being considered because, again, it wasn't thought to be anything people would be interested in. Next. So we have to say, thank you, Betty. Thank you for being such a great steward for all of the volunteer work she's done over the years, Bryce Historical Society, the Genesee Lighthouse, and thank you for calling the Landmark Society before you decided to do something unfortunate with your wonderful archive. So here is Betty, at age 85, sitting at her never-used fireplace with her beloved toys that still are here today with us today, Teddy, Sporty Dog, and Kitty sitting on her lap. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Cynthia, the Brereton man who wrote that treatise about women and working.
Yes.
Do you know anything about his background?
I know nothing about. I found a lot of these. I had forgotten I had some of these, a suitcase in addition to the other materials. I didn't start to look through it till last week, and I started. I have got a row. That's where I found that book, and I started looking through it and going, this is amazing. It's not what I expected to read. It was real. I don't know who this man is, but I'd like to know more. It's like, give me an intern that's a history major so they can go off and research. But one of the rolls that I have at home that I have not unrolled because I know some of the material is fragile, I have every birth certificate, baptismal certificate, and marriage license as part of this archives, but they've been rolled in a roll for probably 80 or close to or more years, and I want to talk to a colleague who is a paper conservator because I did slightly unroll one of the baptismal certificates, and I knew this would happen because my great-grandparents' certificate is the same thing happened. I unrolled it just a little bit, and it was already cracked, so I did not dare. Yeah, if any of you have any paper that you'd like to have fixed or you want to flatten it out, don't do it at home. But out in Honey Eye Falls, Gary Albright is a nationally renowned paper conservator. Go to his website. I don't know if he's done work for Reese Historical.
We had a talk on it by him several years ago.
Yeah, Gary's is the expert, and I want to talk to him before I do any further unrolling because I don't want anything to crack because some of the paper is very brittle. Any other questions? How many of you know Betty? Well, now you know a little bit more. Yes, and we have her Braggin's cousins in the back. And I didn't know Betty had any cousins, but this is on her dad's side of the family. So I was delighted to meet them. And they have been hearing things that I think are brand new for your side of the family, even though you've known Betty for decades. Yes?
I've in the last few months, I've come across some recently discovered photo albums from my ancestors, the Dosenbachs, that my sister discovered. And my grandmother, Adeline Dosenbach, daughter of Theodore, the park band leader, was part of the Campfire Girls in the 1910s. Yeah.
Really?
There are many. I've got, well, several.
All right, we need to talk later because this is, well, again, even in the newspaper, I don't think the woman who thought she had started the first Campfire Girls in the 1950s, because you read this big article, it's a half a page, ooh, I discovered them and brought them to Rochester. They didn't realize, and I don't know, I think the Girl Scouts kind of superseded Campfire Girls, although when I was growing up in the late 60s, I knew there were Campfire Girl groups like out in the suburbs, they weren't in the city. So I really don't know the local history.
This is labeled by Adeline, and they're the 19-teens, and they lived up at 28 Upton Park, so it's a totally different neighborhood.
Yes, it is.
But they also have the Campfire Girls at their cottage at Kannewischer Lake. Maybe they hosted them, but there's, you know, good
Well, I know in 1917, the article is talking about this gathering. It says there are 200 Campfire Girls in Rochester, New York right now. And they're apparently in different, I don't know what they call them, groups. I don't think they're troops. So let's talk. Yes.
If anybody else has a question, let me take the mic to them so the camera can hear. Are there any other questions? Comments? Well, you were all very patient for the first 15 minutes. I want to thank Pat from for fixing whatever the problem was. I hope you enjoyed the story.
And this is a very important person because he's the one that figured it out.
Now, the original idea, we were going to live stream this. Was it still live streamed, Pat? Was it still live streamed? Oh, it was. Okay. But this will be made into a video, and we will be putting it on our website probably in a week or two. So thank you very much. Thank you so much. We've been working on this for about a year, planning this, and it almost didn't work.
And I wanted to do, I thought this would make a really, because there's so much material that it would make a really interesting one.
Very interesting story, though. Can you imagine saving all that? We'll be here again next month on the second Tuesday of May. If you're not a member, I'd encourage you to become a member and help support us in telling these stories. We hope to have a new book out, hopefully by the end of the summer, on Volume 2 of Pioneer Families of Greece. So, thank you all.
Thank you.
Upcoming second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society. Times, dates, and locations for the following programs are subject to change. Please check our Facebook page for updated information. Want to learn more from the Greece Historical Society and Museum? Then click that subscribe button. Hit that bell icon to get notified when there's new content coming from the Greece Historical Society. You can visit us on the web at GreeceHistoricalSociety.org. You can find us on Facebook at Greece Historical Society. And you can stop in at the Greece Historical Society at 595 Long Pond Road.